During the 1970s, institutional capture became a very important issue in the scientific community. The general thrust was an attempt to understand what had reduced infectious disease mortality for diseases like tuberculosis, diphtheria, polio, pneumonia, influenza, scarlet fever, measles, rheumatic fever, and pertussis. More specifically, there was a concern regarding medical triumphalism in general. Whether medicine's role in the reduction of infectious disease mortality was overstated, and if perhaps disease reduction was more attributable to broader social progress and socioeconomic determinants like sanitation, housing, and nutrition. Notable examples of the scientific community speaking out included Thomas McKeown, René Dubos, Richard Lewontin, Stephen Jay Gould, and Archie Cochrane. Ivan Illich's medical nemesis also landed in this climate in 1975. Among the most prominent members of the scientific community were founding member and president of the Infectious Diseases Society of America, Edward Cass, and Nobel laureate Macfarlane Burnet. In 1977, the McKinley study was published, which concluded, among other things, that all medical measures combined, which includes shots of all sorts, contributed at most 3.5% to the decline in mortality for the diseases included in their study, which looked specifically at influenza, pneumonia, diphtheria, whooping cough, and polio. In 1970, Edward Cass spoke at a meeting sponsored by the American Society for Microbiology. In the speech, Cass alludes to a bias in the medical community regarding what was responsible for the eradication of the great killers of the past, diseases like tuberculosis, diphtheria, pneumonia, scarlet fever, measles, rheumatic fever, and pertussis. Regarding tuberculosis, Cass states, quote, "The overall decline in deaths from tuberculosis was not altered measurably by the discovery of the tubercle bacillus, the advent of the tuberculin test, the appearance of BCG vaccination, the widespread use of mass screening, the intensive anti-tuberculosis campaigns, or the discovery of streptomycin. Only the discovery of isoniazid changed the mortality patterns, and by then the rate of tuberculosis had fallen to but a small fraction of its levels 100 years earlier." Unquote. He goes on to state, quote, "Similar trends have been reported with respect to diphtheria, scarlet fever, rheumatic fever, pertussis, measles, and many others." Unquote. Disease reduction correlated primarily not with new medical discoveries or pharmaceuticals, but rather with what he called improving socioeconomic conditions, citing things like reduced overcrowding and better access to nutrition, sanitation, and electricity. A few years later, in his 1973 book, Genes, Dreams, and Realities, Nobel laureate Macfarlane Burnet wrote the following, "I think it would fit best with the general approach of this book to look rather critically at that perennially repeated justification for work in molecular biology, that all competently done research in fundamental aspects of biology will help towards discovering the cause and cure of cancer. I believe that most scientists who make this claim, usually to justify public support for their own work, feel that they are virtually compelled by social forces to tell this white lie with as much apparent conviction as they can muster. They know that their own work is rated as good by their peers, who are concerned not at all with its bearing on cancer, but deeply with its originality, its integrity of approach and interpretation, the elegance of the methods used, and the implications it will have for the interpretation of other biological phenomena. They are rightly proud of their achievement and equally rightly feel that they have won the right to go on with their researches. But their money comes from politicians, bankers, foundations, who are not capable of recognizing the nature of the scientist's attitude towards science, and who still feel, as I felt myself 30 years ago, that medical research is concerned only in preventing or curing human disease. So our scientists say what is expected of them. Their grants are renewed, and both sides are uneasily aware that it has all been a dishonest piece of play acting. But then most public functions are." Unquote. A few years after that, in 1977, the McKinley study was published in the Milbank Quarterly, entitled "The Questionable Contribution of Medical Measures to the Decline of Mortality in the United States in the 20th Century," which was prefaced with the statement, quote, legislators, practitioners, and the public may deem it as heretical, but analysis of United States data shows that introduction of specific medical measures and expansion of services account for only a fraction of the decline in mortality since 1900, unquote. And in the conclusion of the study, the McKinleys write, quote, more specifically, with reference to those 5 conditions, influenza, pneumonia, diphtheria, whooping cough, and poliomyelitis, for which the decline in mortality appears substantial after the point of intervention, and on the unlikely assumption that all this decline is attributable to the intervention, it is estimated that at most 3.5% of the total decline in mortality since 1900 could be ascribed to medical measures introduced for the diseases considered here, unquote. In 2020, American physician David Kindig followed up on the McKinley study in a paper entitled The Still Limited Contribution of Medical Measures to Declines in Mortality. In this paper, Kindig describes the importance of the McKinley study, even calling it, quote, the seminal paper in the modern field of population health science, unquote. Kindig also points out there was only one italicized sentence regarding the contribution of medical measures that appeared in the McKinley study, which was, quote, a society that spends so much on healthcare that it cannot or will not spend adequately on other health-enhancing activities may actually be reducing the health of its population, unquote. Perhaps even more interesting, Kindig adds, quote, as surprising as this may have been in 1977, it is even more shocking that the question has not yet been adequately answered, unquote. Lastly, Kindig points out that the McKinleys do not take an anti-vaccine stance, and he includes a direct quote from the McKinleys for anyone interpreting their study as such. Quote, we consider this an egregious misinterpretation of our research. Effective vaccines clearly have an important role in the ongoing containment of a disease after its prevalence has been reduced, unquote. In their study, the McKinleys' position was only that vaccines were not what eradicated the aforementioned 5 deadly diseases they focused on in their study, but Kindig also included the following direct quote from the McKinleys, quote, if the current coronavirus follows the established course of the several infectious diseases of the past we examined, then promising therapeutics or vaccines will have little effect on any overall decline in the disease, unquote. Kindig is a physician, Emeritus Professor of Population Health Sciences and Emeritus Vice Chancellor for Health Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Medicine and Public Health. He was elected to the Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Sciences in 1996, and is the Emeritus Co-Chair of the Institute of Medicine Roundtable on Population Health Improvement. When institutional capture occurs, the appearance of a consensus is illusory because much of the consensus could just be acquiescence, which is a far cry from genuine sympathy. Those who merely acquiesce are really just responding to peer pressure, preserving their reputations and careers, and avoiding having their licenses suspended or revoked. Why do we forget about these so easily? Because we're encouraged to do so by the mass media, which now has extended its reach into social media, where it spreads like wildfire. This is exactly what happened to one of the most reputable scientists in the world at the time, Stanford professor John Ioannidis, who holds 4 academic appointments, who has served on the editorial board of over 20 scientific journals, and who wrote the most accessed article in the history of Public Library of Science. Early in 2020, Ioannidis said that the mortality rate was much lower than the official count, and that the lockdowns were more dangerous than the disease itself. A few weeks later, the Condé Nast-owned magazine, Wired, ran an article on Ioannidis entitled Prophet of Scientific Rigor and a COVID Contrarian. The author accurately described Ioannidis as a fixture in medical school curricula and one of the most cited scientists of any type in the world, who may be peerless on this metric among physicians. But as is always the case in any prominent media hit piece, the author garners support by playing the politics card, stating that Ioannidis' message happens to align with the right-wing message that it's time to open up the economy. The author then paints Ioannidis as overconfident, stating that Ioannidis sounded sure of himself. He was right. The others had it wrong. What he forgot to mention was that there were a great many who sided with Ioannidis. He also forgot to mention that many remained silent only out of peer pressure, preserving their reputations and careers, and fear of having their licenses suspended or revoked. Then the author of the article claimed that he had seen something on the faces of the medical students he was observing. He wrote, "A week ago, Ioannidis's legacy in medical science seemed unassailable. Today, not so much. I saw it on the faces of those medical students. To them, Ioannidis may always be the fringe scientist who pumped up a bad study that supported a crazy right-wing conspiracy theory in the middle of a massive health crisis." In fact, this is the kind of treatment that all qualified members of the scientific community who held dissenting opinions received, such as critical care physician Pierre Kory and cardiologist Peter McCullough, both of whom were extremely well published and had the courage, unlike most others, to testify before Congress. Perhaps the premier example was the Great Barrington Declaration in October of 2020, the authors of which advocated focused protection and herd immunity instead of indiscriminate lockdowns. This declaration would go on to receive tens of thousands of signatories from the medical and scientific communities. But a combination of censorship and allusions to misinformation and fact-checkers in the media was enough to keep the declaration, even with that many signatories, from gaining enough traction. To hear the testimonies directly from Kory, McCullough, and the three epidemiologists who authored the Great Barrington Declaration, see the part 2 of this video. So this is more than just agency capture, or capture of the regulatory apparatus. This involves broader institutions, including the media and the education system. So we have to contend with both media amplification, which now includes social media, and an education system where medical schools rely upon grants from the NIH and other members of the donor class, who benefit when textbooks and curricula emphasize medical interventions over other, far more important determinants of public health. Understandably, one does have to be in the right kind of mood to think about this unfortunate history and embrace its inherent negativity. No wonder then that we often find ourselves just ignoring it. But there's another layer to this, which, once again, we have the media to thank for, and which is fundamental to the problem, and that is the disappearing ability on the part of citizenry to have positive, productive political discourse, even when in the right mood. What we mostly see is polarization, tribalism, and hair-trigger tempers. We're hamstrung by a conditioning that has throttled what could otherwise be productive political discourse much of the time. Thanks to the media cueing, shaming and gaslighting have become the preferred methods for dealing with dissent. And the cognitive dissonance this creates increasingly encourages us to just skip these conversations altogether. In other words, we're becoming increasingly self-censoring.